Hello and welcome back to Web 110 HTML and CSS. So these next two videos are going to correlate with Chapter 5's content, which is going to focus on working with text and images. So I'm going to put all of the text things in this video, and then the following video is going to be looking at all the image content, just so you kind of have an idea of what to expect. So right now I have Visual Studio Code open. So kind of like we've done in a earlier video, I'm going to have us write the notes for this topic in our code, and then we can actually apply what we're talking about depending on the case to that particular code. So we're going to start first by just our basic template. Do file, and this one doesn't need to be in a subfolder, so I'm just going to put it in my week 3 folder. So I've got week 3, and then I'm just going to call this fonts. Hit save, and then do our typical beginning. For title, let's do, I say text styles, just because it's a little bit more specific than just fonts. In fact, maybe I should have named this text instead of fonts. And let's put our styles as internal. So this is where I was talking about in styles in a previous video, where it's going to be a better practice for you to link to your styles in an external style sheet. But for the sake of lecture and trying to use our screen space as most effective as possible, I'm going to just put everything in the same file, so that way it's going to be a little bit easier for you to follow along and be able to pause and double check your work as you go along. So we're going to add a section for adding styles, and then we shouldn't need anything else here in the head section. So then we can go and add the body. So we could start with an H1, and we could just say text styles as a starting place. Now, one of the things that I think tends to be a little bit confusing word-wise is when you're going to have the word font in your style. And so, let's see if I can find a picture. I think a good way to remember when to use the word font when you are trying to remember the name of the various different properties that you can use when you are styling your text is going to be going back to the PowerPoint from chapter 3 and talking about font family, which is something that I basically skipped over, but it's going to be all of the things that essentially is grouped together as part of this font family. So if you have text that is styled where it's italicized, if it's bolded in some way, if it's got a really kind of thin line, this is not going to quite fit for what we're looking at, because this is saying font color, but there is font size. So any of these things that are kind of looking at the actual individual characters themselves and how they are styled, that's going to be more where you're going to see that word font. And then things that are styling other parts of the text, like the general spacing of the whole text as it fits inside of a paragraph, those are going to use other sort of terms. So hopefully that will help you remember some of these names. All right, so we're going to start with our first one. I'm going to put this in H2 so we can think about the hierarchy of the information. So first one is going to be called font family. Actually, let me do lowercase, because actually when you're writing it, it would look like this. So we have font family, and with the font family, we're going to have the options of choosing serif, sans serif, your book also goes ahead and lists like monospace, cursive, fantasy. There might be some other ones that the browsers might have defined, but the two that you would see most often would be serif or sans serif fonts. And we had looked at it with the chapter 3 content, when is appropriate to use serif or when is appropriate to use sans serif. When you're working with a screen device, it's going to be better to use sans serif. Sans meaning without, so it's going to be without those decorative details. So it's common to use serifs like Georgia and Times New Roman for headings, and then for your paragraphs and your lists, that's when you would want to use sans serif fonts like Verdana and Arial. So what we can do, since we have these headings, is I could go in and I could say when we have an H1 and when we have an H2, then I want to have my font family set to, and what's nice about having these text editors is sometimes they will give you some suggestions. And if you're not really familiar with fonts, you would just kind of want to look towards the end of these lists to see, all right, so these are sans serif. We've got Times New Roman, that's a serif. This is actually a really good example. And what you'll notice when you are defining your fonts is you usually have a list. And what's happening here is it's saying, if possible, I would like to use Times New Roman. If that option doesn't work based off of what the person has on their own computer, then I want to use Times as a fallback option. And then if that computer doesn't support that either, then just whatever kind of default serif font there is, I want to use that. And what you'll notice with this one is if there are spaces in the name of the font, then you have to put it in quotes, and it can be in single quotes or it can be in double quotes. It's just, it needs to match. So the front and the end of it needs to match, but you could write that either way. So this is going to give these 3 different options for this particular scenario. And then I could say, now for the paragraph, I want the font family to be, and then this is where we would probably want to pick something that's going to be sans serif. And it's kind of hard to see because this list goes on horizontally, but this one's pretty good choice. So we'll see, got Verdana, Geneva, Tahoma, sans serif. So what we could do now is save this, and I need to go ahead and open this up so we can take a look at it in the browser. And I'm gonna zoom in a little bit as we go along with these, so it'll hopefully be a little easier to see. And just a reminder, because I know that I've been throwing a lot at everyone as we're working, if you go to view, you can switch to word wrap. I try not to use word wrap too much because it can make it a little bit hard for you to follow along with what's on the screen, just because it doesn't line up so well. But when I have something like this that kind of carries on a lot, I feel like the word wrap can potentially help a little bit. So I think I'm going to turn that on to make it a little easier to see. All right, so that is going to be our first style property, font family. The next one that I want us to take a look at is going to be called font size. So what I'm going to have us do is create a H2 after this, do font size. And then, so font size, I'll just write fonts can be written in a variety of units. So this is where you probably would want to reference your textbook so you can actually see everything written out, but you can have them written, and this might be a good spot for a list, because then we can say we can write them out in general sizes. So an example would be like medium, large, small. And then you can also use pixel as a unit. You can use, which is actually abbreviated. Let's do pixel, it's PX. And then you can do points. Now, points is something that's used more when you are working with graphic design and you're actually printing something, and that's abbreviated to PT. So you're pretty much never going to use that out of all of these options. It's probably the least helpful one, except for if you are creating a style sheet for a printed version of your website. So if someone were going to go to File, Print, Preview, and they wanted to print everything out, that might be a case where they would use that. And then M's actually gets used a lot, and it comes from printmaking where things were measured with the width of the letter M, and it's something that gets set depending on the screen size. And so it's used a lot because it's responsive. And then you can also just use percentages as well. So what we could do for this is, I mean, there's already going to be these default sizes and everything, but we could go in and we could add in some specifics. So maybe we want to say, let me do, H1 font size. Let's just do like 3M, so you can get kind of a feeling for what these sizes actually mean. And then we could do an H2, 2M, and then for paragraph, I'm just going to add to this one and I'll just say 1M. And I might have to, so I zoomed in to make that a little easier to see. So this is actually the default of what that would really look like. And that actually looks kind of believable. It's maybe a little bit large. But something to consider is when you are working with screens, you might remember back to writing papers, and maybe you're still doing this, but a lot of times professors and teachers, they'll say that you want to write your papers at 12-point font, and that size is fine when you are printing it out, but when you have something on a screen, you actually want to go for a larger size, and that's going to be maybe 16 or 18 or something. But what's really nice is if you know what sort of size you want, you can go to one of these converters and you can switch between the different sizes, and it'll help you figure out what would be appropriate. So maybe you are working with a graphic designer and they're more familiar with working with points, and they've determined the style guide that you're going to use, or maybe it's even you coming up with the style guide. But you have come up with the style guide to fit a certain unit, and the person who is going to be making the website, or you, want to use a better method for making it responsive, like working with M's or percentages. What this can do is it can help you figure out, okay, well, they told me that they want it to be 14 points, and so what would be the number in M's, or what would be the number in percentages, and you would be able to switch that. So this is just one that I was able to find by doing a search online. I'm not necessarily tied to this or think that it works any better than any other conversion. I linked to this on Canvas if you want to take a look at it. I just thought it was really nice that you could easily type into here and be able to see that number generated for you really easily. All right, so the next one that we're going to take a look at, I'm going to create another H2, is going to be called font weight. And a good way of thinking about this one is weight has to do with how heavy or light something is. For some reason, when first learning about all of these style properties, there's another one that I'll go ahead and just introduce this at the same time. Font style. So this is actually going to be how we replace working with bold and italics and strong and emphasis, which were introduced in chapter 2. So those, we're adding those tags to the structure in the HTML, which is something that I talked about before that we really don't want to do. We want to do all of our styles and our visual design in our CSS. So anything that has bold, strong, emphasis, italics, we want to replace with font weight and font style. But anyways, people have a tendency to get these a little bit confused. So try to just think of the font weight as how heavy or light something is. So that's going to be just kind of the general thickness of the character lines. And then the style is kind of hard not to say. It's the style of the style. Style is such a generic word, but it's going to be like if it's italicized or not, or oblique or normal. So what we can do here, let me just list these. Okay, so font weight can have, basically it's bold. You could also have normal. One of the nice things that you'll see with it being able to bring up different styles for you is it also shows you some other ways that your book doesn't really talk about these values, and you'll have to see for yourself whether or not your browser is going to show these values. But bold and normal should work fine. And this is really great for overwriting things. So we have our default styles right now in the browser are that our H1 and our H2s are bolded. And maybe rather than it being that we want to bold our lists or that we want to bold our paragraphs, maybe it's just that we want to unbold our H2s and we want to style them in another way to create emphasis. That was another thing that was talked about with the chapter 3 is we don't have to do our emphasis in one way. There's going to be multiple ways of creating emphasis. And that's kind of up to you to figure out how you might want to style things. So font style is going to be if something is normal, italic, oblique. So what I want to do is probably with the H2, and you'll notice I'm writing things kind of in order that they're showing up on the page, but also I'm trying to write things where if it's going to be part of that H1, H2 group, I'm going to put it together. If it's part of just the H1, I'm going to add it to the H1. If it's part of the H2, I'm going to add it. One thing that I've seen some students do is when they're following the homework directions and they're told to add styles, they'll just go ahead and add a new rule and they'll just kind of write something else. You want to make sure that you condense it all together, and then you also kind of write it in a hierarchy. So because the H1 and the H2 is applying to both of them, I think it's better to include that towards the top. And then if something is specific to the H1 or H2, then it can kind of overwrite that more general style. And then also you want to think about having the order of things. Now these are all kind of equal importance, as in they're not going to be nested inside each other at all. So you don't really have to worry so much about the order, but I would say that it's probably good to think about the general hierarchy, because you're not going to have an H2 above your H1. You're going to have your H1 before that. So it's going to make sense to put them in this order so it's easier to read in the end, because by the end of the semester, you're actually going to have a lot of styles in your style sheets. So you want to make it as easy as possible to read everything. And I'm going to try to make it easy for you by writing things in the homework directions in a pretty good order. But you'll find that by adding the styles every week, that it will start getting kind of complex, because you're not always going to, once you're adding it to what's already there, it's going to start getting a little out of order unless you go and you correct it. All right, so what I want to do with the H2 is I'm going to remove the bold. So I'm going to say font weight. Oh, is it going to? Okay, so here it's actually giving me some more options. It's telling me numbers. And so you might want to try these out to see what this value actually really looks like by choosing it. But we have bold, bolder, lighter, normal, inherit. So you could have it inherit it from somewhere else. I'm just going to have it be normal. So it's going to remove that bold so we can style it a different way. And then what we could do is do font style. And then here we've got, now for some reason it doesn't list out like oblique or normal. So you can't always rely on your text editor to know everything. If you're having a hard time remembering what all the values are, go to your textbook or go to the W3 Schools examples online. they're going to give you a lot of different information, especially if there's something that's kind of outdated. It will let you know if something technically works, but there might be a better option. All right, so we're going to say this is going to be bold, or not bold anymore, and then it's going to be italicized. So it's going to be styled in a different way. All right, so the next thing that we are going to look at is going to be line height. And this is something that I mentioned really briefly in that PowerPoint. And that's this idea of things that are a little bit more specific to graphic design, like working with kerning and tracking. Line height is correlating with leading, which was based off of how much space, how much lead you would put in between lines of letterpress when people would be printmaking. And so this line height is basically the height between your lines and how to determine how much spacing. Now, there's the way that you write it is a little bit more straightforward, because you can basically say that you want, I like to think of it sort of as ratios, and I'm not going to even bother really putting any text under this. Let's just go straight to our styles, and I'm going to put, let's see, a good place to put this might be the LI, because they stack over top of each other. So I'll do this. So you can say 1. So if you think of it kind of like a ratio, and that's just your basic number is, or you could say like 100%. So 100% is just your normal basic number. And then if you want your line height to, you might be familiar with if you were writing a paper and you had to double space your paper, or if you had to do like 1.5 spacing, that's basically the same idea. So double spaced would be like saying 200%. Or you could say like 2.0, and that would get across the same idea. So either way that you would want to write that. Now, when you are reading things on a website, it's a lot harder to read if it does have that default percentage of 100%. And so the recommendation that I found online at a couple different places is to have at least 150%, so 1.5 spacing or higher. Maybe it's a little bit large to go to the point of doing double spacing, but at least 1.5 or 1.6. So you can write that two ways. You can say 150, or, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to write it both ways. And what's going to happen is the second way it's written is going to overwrite the first one. So just so you have a kind of an idea. So you can either write 150%, or I could write like 1.5. And so that's going to make it so the line height for the LI is going to be 1.5. So I'm going to save that, refresh, and you'll see that gives just a little bit more spacing. And we don't have any paragraphs right now that have the text over top of each other, but my recommendation would be have your LI and have your paragraphs both have 1.5 line height, just because that's going to be the text that's most likely to actually stack over top of each other. Usually your headings are never going to be long enough that they're actually going to wrap around, and you shouldn't have to worry about that. And there would be other ways that you could handle that by working with your padding or your margins in some way. All right, next thing, and this is another thing that we had talked about in that PowerPoint, but just really, really briefly, and that's text alignment. So this is where we're getting to a point where so far we have font weight, font style. I guess line height doesn't have the word font in it. So we're getting to a point where we're no longer looking at the font family and the various ways of working with the characters. Instead, we're thinking about how to organize the text itself. And so that's where we're starting to have these different terms. So line height is focusing on the lines. And then these other ones we're going to be looking at are going to be looking at the text, but the text as a grouping, not as the characters. It's kind of like if you're familiar with working with Photoshop or Illustrator, you might be familiar with working with things either with the character settings or with the paragraph settings. That's kind of the similar idea here. So with this next one, it's going to be this next one is going to be text alignment. And you have a couple options here, and that's going to be left, center, right, and justify. And so let me see if I can find an image. I'm sorry, I can't help myself. I just saw this picture and I thought this is pretty interesting. This is not the case, but I think it does get across an interesting point where it's showing that if you are working with justified text, which means that the lines of text go all the way from the left to the right, and then it kind of spreads out the lines and it can add some awkward spacing. That's very much for printed material. And so it's really not going to be used for when you're working with screens. And you can kind of even see that this is coming from a website that says, does text alignment matter for accessibility and usability? So it looks like that's part of the point they're trying to make. Having your text right aligned means that your text lines up on the right side and that it's going to be uneven on the left, which makes it harder for us to read because we read from left to right. Now, I disagree with this. This would not make somebody an idiot. There are going to be cases where you would want things to be aligned on the right. For example, this could be really useful if you are looking at the navigation and you wanted to have a list of things on the navigation and you wanted it to align to the top right. It's not going to go on to the next line, so you're not going to have a hard time reading it at all. And the fact that it's going to align to the right is more important. So that would be a case. Another case where you might see this would be when you are filling out a form. Let me see if I can find a picture. This might be a case where you would use right alignment. Again, for the labels of a form, it is helpful to have the labels be really close to where you're putting in your text input. And again, it's not something that's going on to the next line, so you don't have to worry about things lining up with each other. And even though it's uneven on this side, the fact that it's really close to these boxes that you're filling in makes for a much better user experience versus if everything here was left aligned, it would create unnecessary space between each of these boxes and it would be a lot harder to read. So this previous picture of, here it is. This previous picture is very simplified as to what it's trying to explain. Centering, also not necessarily the case. Now there's going to be certain things that are very hard to read when they're centered. So centering works really good for headings because it only captures information that is on a single line. You could have an image with text underneath of it that also could be centered, and that's going to feel really well balanced. And so that would work really well. But if you have a paragraph or if you have a list, that's going to be really difficult to read. So it's just about knowing the right place for it. And then left alignment is the default for a reason. It's easy to read and it works really well responsively, but take all of that with a grain of salt. This helps illustrate a little bit better what this actually looks like. Let me see if I can open that. I think this also helps show too, if you are working with a paragraph, like, now this actually works a little bit better because it's tapering down into kind of a triangle. So it's not the hardest to read, but if each of your lines has a very different line length, that can make it really hard to read, kind of going back and forth. So left alignment aligns up on the left. Centering, it just kind of adds space evenly on both sides. Right aligned, add space on the left side. And then justified is going to kind of add in extra space between these letters, and that's where you get those rivers. which can sometimes be hard to read. It basically means that it becomes distracting when you have this white space and it's too close to each other, because then it kind of disrupts your flow of being able to read the text as you go across horizontally. It kind of leads your eye vertically instead. And so what people do when they're working with printed material is they go in and they manually adjust this to try to make it fit as best as possible, so that way it's not distracting. But we don't have that luxury of being able to do that when we're working with responsive websites, because it changes so much. Now, if you were working with a website where you had a fixed layout, you could potentially do that, but then you risk so many other things of not being able to control other aspects of the website. All right, so that's going to be our alignment. So what we can do is, I would say probably a good place for adding some alignment would be our headings. So I can say text align, and I'm going to say center, because actually, let's do a couple different ones. So I'm going to do this for the H1 and H2. So I'm going to say I want the H1 to text align center, and then I want the H2 to text align right, and then I want the paragraph, which this is already the browser default, but I want the paragraph to text align left. And then we'll just use the browser default for the LI, because it would be very strange, I think, to try to use justify. All right, so this looks pretty strange the current way that it is, because as I said in a previous video, whenever we are working with our individual elements, they technically span the whole width of the website, at least for now, until I introduce working with the display and I introduce working with width and height. But we've got the H1 is centered, we've got the H2s right now are right aligned, which is hard to read because it's so far away from the rest of the text. But I would say I don't think it actually looks too bad when it's smaller, because as it's smaller, it still kind of gets our attention, and then we can kind of still see the text underneath of it. So that could be something that you might be interested in, but maybe it's just a matter of having a more narrow column when you are working with your headings as right aligned. And because it only goes one line, it's really not that big of a deal. All right, next thing is going to be text decoration. And text decoration has a couple of different values. There's going to be none, underline, overline, and line through. And you'll see a few other options listed in your text editor potentially, but these are the ones that are talked about in the book. And so these are going to allow for you to add a little bit more decoration. So I do think that this is not the most legible. This could be a little easier to read, and so potentially putting underline here might help. So we could try this first, text decoration. Let's do underline. And so that kind of helps break up the space visually, so we can kind of see that a little bit better. If you want to, you can, as you're going through these examples, if you want to, you can add as many things as you want. And it's okay if this is your opportunity to make, the worst and the best style choices, get it all out of your system, kind of get used to things. So for example, I could do text decoration, whoops. Maybe try a line through. That, especially with the fact that that is a serif, that's making it much harder to read because it's kind of confusing, especially with that E, but we're free to do whatever we want right now. So you could even do the same. You could do like a line through in your list. your list items. All right, so what else do we have? We have text indent. So this would work better if we have a paragraph. What I might have us do is grab some lorem ipsum. If you're not familiar with that term, it's basically filler text. Now there's a website that's called lipsum.com, and it comes from this term lorem ipsum. It's basically this fake text that's supposed to look a little bit like Latin, but it really isn't. But this website's really great because you can basically just kind of create some filler text, and designers use this all the time where you could be waiting to get copy from the client and you have a general idea of how much content's going to be there. So here you have the option of how many paragraphs, how many words, how much would be in the list. So I can generate a paragraph and it's going to create this lorem ipsum for me, and I can just copy this, and then I'm going to put this in a paragraph underneath of here. And that's where it might be better to remove the word wrap, because then it's not going to take up so much space and we can kind of see these notes a little clearer. So I might go back and forth a little bit between those. But now that I have this paragraph that we'll actually be able to see what it looks like, let's actually preview it first. So here, all of it is just by default left aligned, and then everything's starting over here. But what we could do to try to make this stand out a little bit better is with our paragraph, we could say, I want to have a text indent, and you can use probably, I think the best units for this would be probably ems and pixels. You could do something that is a little bit more responsive. I just think that trying to do something like a percentage, because it's based off of the width, it would vary so much that I don't think that you could really control very well how that looks. I think pixels would work pretty well. The nice thing about ems is that it would give you kind of a little bit of responsiveness with working with a mobile device. So let's try like 10em, and that might be a bit much, maybe about 5. I'm going to try not to get too distracted with styles, because once I start going down that rabbit hole, I start liking to fiddle around way too much with things. All right, so it might look a little weird on these places where there's just a little bit of text, but I think it works really well on this paragraph to help kind of divide up the content. And what we could do is we could always take this paragraph and split it into smaller pieces to be able to kind of see this a little bit better. You can also see this full screen to kind of get a better idea of how that looks. All right, so that's going to be our text indent. And then next is going to be text transform. And text transform is going to be really handy for when you are getting content from someone else. So when someone is giving you the content, they could be giving it to you in a Word document or something, maybe it's even just an email, and they're going to give you all the different headings that they want, the paragraphs that they want, the list that they want, and perhaps it's part of your style guide to have all of the headings look all uppercase, or maybe you've got lowercase or just capitalized, and then maybe you want to do an update where you want to be able to change it to something else rather than going in and retyping your font, so that way you have some parts of it uppercase, some parts of it lowercase. You can use the text transform and you can choose from the options of capitalize, uppercase, lowercase, and none, and then that just switches it for you. So we already have all of our text the way that it is right now, but what we could do, because right now I think our headings, it has the underline, but it could potentially stand out more. Sorry to hesitate. I was just thinking, and this is where I'm going down the rabbit hole, I don't know. I kind of like the lowercase, how this F looks. But let's go ahead and switch it. I might change my mind, but let's do H2 and we'll do text transform. And let's do uppercase. So I can save that, refresh. Yeah, I do not like that as much. It does stand out for sure. I don't like it. I'm gonna move it. So I'm gonna do Command, or you can do Control X to cut that. I'm gonna put that on the H1. All right. I had a feeling, yeah, because that works okay. It might actually make that strike through a little easier to read anyways. And this is actually going to tie in pretty nicely with this next one, so I talked a little bit about kerning and tracking, and we can't really control things so much for individual tiny pieces, but we can do a little bit with letter spacing. So letter spacing is going to affect the spacing between different characters. So if you ever have any text that you feel like is kind of a little bit too close together and potentially a little hard to read, you can go in and you can change the letter spacing. And so let's do this for starters on the H1. So I'm just going to put in 1 pixel for starters. So you can see it gave it just a little bit more spacing. And now let me put a negative in front of it. So it's bringing everything a little closer together. Let's go more extreme. So now it's really tightening and kind of bringing everything together. Now that's really not going to work very well with something like these serifs, but what this could help with is the opposite. If we do a positive number, we could spread these letters out a little bit, and it's going to make it actually a little easier to read the fact that it is serif. So when I say try not to do serif fonts, there's going to be different options that you can work with serif fonts to make it okay. For example, we've got this list here. This is still in a serif font. It can be a little bit hard to read, especially with the size that this is. So there's certain things that we could do with it. We could try to make sure that we pick a font that has a tall X height. We could make it a little bit larger. We could change the boldness. So it's, in this case, you probably would not want this to be lighter. So what we could do with this is maybe we could try to add a little bit of line spacing here. Maybe now, sorry, letter spacing. Now we wouldn't want to do something as large as the heading. So you're gonna have to think about the size the text is and kind of the equivalent of that. But we could try 1 pixel here, and it's just gonna spread things out a little bit. Now here, if we were to do even like 2, that's going to seem really extreme. But even just 1, and then maybe if we made the size a little larger, let's do like 1.2. Or sorry, 1.2 M. And that I think helps a lot, even though it is serif, just to make it a little easier to read. All right, so let me just kind of show you how this looks. So we've got all this. Now you might notice that there's definitely some things that could look a lot better, like this spacing here is really hard to read. And that's one thing that I've been told by students a lot, is that I focus a lot on padding and margins, because it really does affect a lot of how well you can read something. This really goes to show just how you organize your content makes a big difference. Something like this would be really hard to read, this paragraph going all the way across the page, versus if you were to put your content into columns that were closer to this size, this would be a lot easier to read. And then something like this would be easier enough to read on mobile, but you can probably see already having this kind of content here with these headings right aligned, but then the text all the way over here. This really isn't an ideal way to read it. It kind of is interesting to look at stylistically, but your eye basically has to move all the way over to the right and then has to move back to the left and then kind of down again. And it's just very awkward to look at. All right, so this is going to be everything for our text and fonts. And so in the next video, I'm going to talk about working with images in a couple of different ways. So if you have any questions, make sure to leave a comment in the discussion if you think it might be something that other people would benefit from, or you can send me an email.